course, what we do is also a form of expression of our own personality, our own beliefs. But I really, really hate when artists or designers are fully focused on self-expression. I find it so self-indulgent. So we always strive that the work we develop try to comment, to say something, to elaborate on something that is relevant beyond the two of us, our own reality. Even with very personal works, what we mentioned before, like Casaletto, which originated from the loss of my parents, we didn't work at that level. We made it into a reflection of modernism and what influenced our practice and the many other practices in the world. Right? We think design should do that. It has to be much more expansive than a form of self-indulgence, expression of the individuality. We see also politicians, there's too much individuality going on instead of speaking about collectivity. Yeah. So I think the work that we do is trying to reflect that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I have heard you say several times, we're not artists. Make the distinction that, like, you know, we're designers, we're not artists. And I think that's really important.
Yes, also because if you, you know who is always interested in asking us about if we're artists? Mediocre designers. because it is always this push for, now I have been careful to say mediocre, but it's about trying to say design is this, and it's done in this way.
Yeah.
And if you don't do that, then you go in another category. And no, we are designers because we are interested to work within the discipline of design, because if we manage to expand it, to rephrase it, that's what we're interested in doing. Of course, there's many ways that we have been working with artists. There are some artists, I mean, at the end of the day, the first designer were trained as artists, you know, in the context of applied arts and movement and so on. So it's not that the two things are fully separated. I think the separation is also usual for the market, because then if you're an artist, you can be more expensive. But is that true?
Yeah, no, good note. I have one more question about the exhibition. The objects in it explore the relationship between furniture and home, and then this idea of an archetype in design. So I'm curious what archetypes of domestic space tell us about what people want and need from their furniture.
That's a very good question. I think the response to this is in the example I made before of the desk. What I mean to say is that I don't know if that's what people want, but I think that's what people need, which is this sort of object that allow focus, for instance, of clearing up your mind. At least this is how we felt in this moment, that it was important to do. In terms of archetypes, as we mentioned in the walkthrough before, there's also different archetypes that we're referenced to, from the proportions of laptop and digital computers. The lighting, they are all panels, because that's sort of the new contemporary archetype in lighting. I don't think it's anymore, obviously it's not a bulb, but it's the light that is in the surface, because it's the one that illuminates our night when we are awake in front of the phone, and so on. But instead of working and see that as something uncanny, we try to make that into something poetic in the work. The textile piece, the reason one object is extremely important to us is the celebration in a way, or an homage or a reference to a textile work in domestic environment. There is a very subtle embroidery in textile. Those are uncelebrated archetypes.
Yeah.
Often connected, as we said before, to women labor and women's work.
Well, and definitely the quality of light, because I mean we have been working a lot with the medium of light since probably 10 years.
Yeah.
And before starting to work with Floss, since the company we were working with for the industrial design part, we did like a huge investigation into the archetype of lighting. It was called Foundation. It was a very similar project because we were really looking into what means doing design with light. And it was like a big show that was really experimenting with the medium of light. And I think for that moment on, we also understood the power of light. And I think these shows, I mean, there are also other objects like a chair and a table, but it's really about light. It's a medium that we really usually love. And I think those light are also an archetype of the kind of light you wanna have a specific part of your house. So for instance, there is like light that's like shining in the ceiling.
Yeah, like the one that yeah.
Or there is a movable lamp, and it's actually also that is an archetype of a movable lamp. Usually you find a small lamp, a table lamp with that system, but you never have very light in that way, apart from the amazing Castellani lamp. It doesn't move. So we're really looking a lot into the archetype of lighting in the show.
Okay. The show also made me think about how there's so many forces shaping design today. So there's the press, there's social media, there's education, there's museums, and there's just culture in general. What role do you think galleries should play in that?
Well, to allow us to work, we cannot do otherwise. And as much as these objects are relatively, you could image them, also produce, with a company, but you can never elaborate a discourse with such complexity in industrial design. Also, nowadays, all brands are interested in selling you whatever, and so whenever you're using something for a brand, very often you find your work mixed up in a pot and thrown out in a more luxurious version of IKEA in terms of the setting up. And I think when you are trying to build a discourse, you need also to have a space to do that. And I think galleries can definitely do that. So I think galleries are there for that, as they have always been, to support the artists or the designers, and to support, also to finance work that otherwise would not exist.
Like an incubator, basically.
Yes. Yes. There's one thing that people do not understand when you are a designer, or I think this is also applicable if you are an artist. Producing work is not only a way to make things, it's actually a way of thinking. When you are a designer, you think also visually. So if you cannot do things, you cannot really think, you cannot articulate your ideas, and that's a hard time. So I think galleries are there to allow us to articulate ideas.
Do you have anything to add, Andre? No. Okay. I want to zoom out for a second. I don't really know how to ask this question, so I'm just going to ask it. I think it's really rare to encounter a designer or a design studio that is so beloved and so widely respected across the board as Formafantasma. Why do you think that is?
What about it? Are you sure about it?
I did a survey, and everyone was like, I'm coming to the top, and they're my favorite. Like, it wasn't even like I like them, they're like, I love them.
I don't know. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe because we do great work.
Yeah, 100%. It's because at Salona you're leading conversations. You're not having a party. You're different, maybe.
Thank you.
Okay. So to finish, we live in a complex world, and I wanted to make sure I asked you a little bit about that. I read that one book that is really important to your practice is called Staying with the Trouble by the multi-species feminist theorist Donna J. Haraway. So I just wondered if you could tell us about that book and why its message is so important for you and how it's relevant for other folks here, even if they're not designers.
Well, I don't know if you're all familiar with the work of Donna Haraway, but I bumped into her work when I was quite young. I was probably 17, I think, when I read the Cyborg Manifesto. It was also really, I read the book and I thought like, wow, this is really explaining who I am, and I didn't know before. And then, I think this is the latest book, the one we're referring, Staying with the Trouble. I'm not going to talk about the full book, but I think what is really special about it is this idea, also in the light of the climate crisis, but I would say of any form of crisis, that she's advocating for this idea of accepting to live in a world that is not complex, problematic, instead of escaping or to try to love all those things that are broken and seem that they also seem unfixable, and to stay within the trouble, not to try to escape the trouble. Because only by doing that, we can also maybe learn to also love those troubles. And this is not visible in all the work we do, but there's a lot of conversation like this in the office. And I think being a designer today is completely about being in the trouble. It's in the trouble about, trying to build a better world at the same time, trying to sell products, to comply to, capital accumulation, the disruption of ecologies. So you can either decide to stay outside of the world or to stay within the world. That's why we never want to work in academia. Not that they are believe in some part of the world, actually, not at all. But it is a way of sort of, if you are a designer, I think you need to practice. That's why we always say our art is a commercial practice. It's a claim we want to have, because even when we work with the biggest corporations or whatever, we really strive to see if we can give meaning to it, to make it in a dignified way. And I think that's a way of being with the trouble.
Yeah, it's a good manifesto for us. I would say that it's really probably the manifesto of the studio is that book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't wait to read it. I had not heard of it until you mentioned it.
No, it's fantastic. It's a book, and it's of course a bit chaotic, as Paula Haraway is, but she's chaotic because she stays with the trouble.
Yeah. Okay, I just want to make sure we have time for a few questions, and I can come to you with the microphone if you want. Does anybody have any burning questions to ask? I know you do. Yes. Okay. You want to?
Well, so my formation, Beyonce, it's about heritage. Do you have what's your biggest observation about heritage here in the States? Can you see any place in a specific project? You mentioned some designers, any space.
Well, the work, we didn't want to talk about this because we don't want to make it the center of the work, but the work obviously has some references to Frank Lloyd Wright, George Nakashima, but also out of the US to Rietveld, to Czech Cubism. So there's a lot of things there. They seem disparate and they somehow come together. The Shaker community, sort of the ethos of the building of the works and so on. And so it was intentional. It wasn't intentional, but maybe it's subliminal. We're working with the of Archetypes, we're working here in the US, and suddenly all the decision making led to the development of this work, which has these references, but it was not intentional. Since the beginning, it's almost emerged from it.
Anybody else? Yes.
I recently saw your exhibition Ultra Terra in Amsterdam. This is completely unrelated to the show. And I'm curious, when you work with creatures like the sheep that you referenced in that show, do you think of them as collaborators or subjects?
No, we cannot say they are collaborators because it would be pretentious. No, but there's plenty, I don't know. There's a lot of work that, I know, suddenly everything is becoming a collaborator, even when it's completely not. And I would wish we could really collaborate with other species. And I think when we are with our own dog, I think there is a form of collaboration, or at least with some collaborations of mutual learning from one another. And we have to learn how to think like a dog, to understand what he was saying, and so on. So in that case, yes, but I think it is a subject.
Well, and that exhibition is specific. It's also actually showing how a process of co-domestication led to exploitation of a resource. And I think when you go through the show there, you see the first animal in the show was the buffon. So there was the first sheep before the sheep we know. And the movement was only losing the hair. And through the collaboration, I would say, of human, then this shearing was not happening anymore, this natural shearing. So the human should have cut the hair. And, you know, there was a moment, of course, in which there was much more balance on that relation, but we know very well with the intensive farming and especially with industrialization, that process was completely broken. And that exhibition really shows or wanted to prove that point.
Hi. I'm really interested in the diversity of your practice. So you're designing products and doing objects that are based on research and development and curating shows and designing exhibitions and doing creative direction and working within companies to change the way they produce. Like it's quite vast. I find it to be incredibly cohesive and actually an interesting model for other designers to think about in terms of how diversification is really about intellectual survival, economic survival, and like a rich way to live and evolve. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how you choose which projects to work on, and you know, maybe how that's shifting as you're saying, you know, and we've known each other for a long time, you've been together for 22 years, how that's changed also as you've worked on more things and matured as designers.
Thank you for the question. How do we choose to work on the works we do? You know, what is interesting is that, especially when it's a commissioned work, I think not museums, but more commercial partners, there is a process of natural selection. I guess sometimes people find us complicated, and so when we start to ask questions or start to engage in a conversation, then suddenly some things just don't go ahead. And the one that goes ahead are the more solid. So it's a process mostly of selection.
I think now, of course, it's different because our practice is much more outspoken, and also we are much more clear about who we are. But we are also in a very specific moment of our studio in which we are thinking how to make sure that the research side is safe. Because, you know, when you have, and we have a lot of commercial work coming, and when I talk about commercial, I'm not talking only about product, I'm also exhibition design for me. It's even for, if it's for cultural institution, for me it's still a commercial client. And the research sometimes is pushed aside, and we are really thinking how to make that survive. Because as you know, I mean, you are also in, in museums, so you know how difficult it is to found projects. And we need to find the right way, maybe dividing the studio, finding also some bureaucratical, how do you say, legal structure that can allow to be sure that we have like a strain of research that, goes.
Basically, we need to guarantee a certain level of autonomy. And that is at risk when you start to grow, you need to pay people, you want to...
But also because, I mean, today, of course, we didn't talk about that part of our studio. There's really the consultancy part, where we help a company, we did it with Archetypes, other company too, to focus more on ecology, and that takes a lot of time. So usually the resources in the studio that work on those projects are the ones that usually make the more autonomous work. So how can we, and it's also exciting for us because we are designers, so we want to be sure that we don't stay only in the world of academia, but we can also have an impact in the discipline, practice of the design. So how can we make sure that that gets safe? So I think in this specific moment, apart from really understanding how we can better select the clients, and that's something that we are struggling every day. Because sometimes you have good clients with money that comes, and then how can you say no? I mean, you also need to be sure that you are able to pay people in this way. So that balance is something that is difficult.
There's another thing that more than selecting clients, I think what we do is referencing briefs. So So when a client comes with a brief, we never give it grant that's the brief we should be working on. So we need to rephrase it until it becomes mutually interesting, rather than just doing what you're asked. Because very often, people, they have an idea, but it's also good to make it more conversational again and find together the way of working, not rather than, we don't want to execute stuff, do you see what I mean?
Okay, I think we have time for one more, maybe from, yeah, you want me to come back then?
Well, I can.
You can yell, okay, cool.
I just wanted to ask a question about the idea of taste. Like you had a very allergic reaction to the idea of taste. And I'm just curious about your practice is very research-based, or that's a big part of it. And I think to do research well, you have to have a point of view. And that point of view helps you to make decisions. But those decisions, at least to me, seem like they have to have a personal motivation, and they have to have, and it comes down at sometimes the idea of personal preference. So I'm just curious of how you draw the line between why is taste so bad versus the idea of personal preference. Like, where do you draw that line?
Yeah, it's two very different things. I hate the word taste. I think it's connected to a bourgeoisie perspective on things and on elegance, which is very safe very often. It's about, it's about the only things that I just said. And I think a personal perspective is completely different than just a question of taste. When I dropped the word taste, I was also just sort of simplifying, I would say an attitude. But I think we learned this very quickly, that what is the most interesting thing is to lead your practice also based on intuition, and not only through rationality, but I think it's a ping pong between the two things. So when your intuition says to go in a direction, or it very often is the right one, but not only based on personal taste. Just because when you start to reflect upon the work, you start to understand its logic. But the more you work, the more you're trained, sort of intuitively you can take decisions which are not irrational, they're intuitive. And the more you train that understanding of the logics behind your intuitive decision making, you can ensure that it just doesn't boil down to personal taste or beauty or all these other elements, which are definitely not enough in today's world. I don't know if is that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would agree on many aspects of that, but I find it always, the moment of the actual moment when you create something is a very mysterious and non-linear process. And that's I agree with the intuition part, and I think that's like, it's just really hard to talk about this one moment because everybody makes a linear conversation about, we started here, we ended up here, and then you do some storyline of how it all relates, but we all know that there was no linear connection.
Yeah. But in fact, it's also the things that I mentioned briefly before when we said that developing work in space with materials, proportions, and so on, for us, it's not a translation of a linear process of research. It's actually thinking in space, thinking with materials. And if you don't do that, like the most original ideas we put in the work, it's not because we read a book, it's because by practice, those ideas originated. So we understood things about complex ideas by making, not really by reading the book. Yeah. So, but the two things, they're not, it's a ping pong between things. When we're having a department in Eindhoven, unfortunately, very often, even if we were trying to escape that, the students were working on research and then they were working on translation. And I hate that idea, even if we were using these words too, because the work is never the translation of the research. It's the research. It's embedding it. So it's much more complex and tangled with the two elements.
think we're gonna have to close, but they will be here for any additional questions if you want to come up. But thank you so much for being here and for listening.